There is a page in a small notebook bound in oilcloth the color of a winter sky. The handwriting belongs to a woman named Maren Velde, who died in the province of Drenthe in the Netherlands in the year 1883. She was 38 years old when she died, and she left behind two things of value. One was a daughter, the other was this notebook. The page in question shows a cross-section of a wall. The layers are labeled in Dutch in a hand so careful and small it seems the woman was trying to fit the whole of what she knew into the least possible space. Clay. Peat sod. Clay again. Sod laid root side down. Sod laid root side up. A notation in the margin reads, "Cold finds the holes before it finds the door." The girl who carries this notebook is 16 years old. Her name is Maren Velde. And on the morning of November 3rd in the year 1887, she stands in the freight depot of Armour, Dakota territory and watches a man count out her wages on the edge of a freight scale. The man's name is Bowen. He is the depot clerk, thin and precise, and he pushes the coins across the metal surface with one finger the way a man handles something he does not entirely want to touch. Outside, sleet ticks against the window glass in small, steady bursts. The sound of it is the sound of time passing too fast. Maren does not speak while Bowen counts. She does not look at the coins. She looks at his hands. 6 weeks of section labor at $1.75 a day. Minus board, minus tool breakage, minus $2 for damages. Bowen calls it inventory reconciliation. Maren does not know those exact words, but she knows the number that remains. She has been counting in her head the whole time. The number is $11.40. She picks the coins up without looking at Bowen's face and walks out through the depot door into a morning that smells of cold smoke and frozen mud. She does not look back. This is how it ended. Here is how it began. Edwin Greer was the section foreman for the Armour rail crew, a wide man with a thin voice and the habit of making decisions before he had all the information he needed. On the morning of November 2nd, a sack of rice went missing from the section house stores. Greer needed a name. He chose Maren Velde. She was the newest hand on the crew. She was the youngest. She was a girl in a place that had never expected a girl to be swinging a spike maul. And she had been there only 6 weeks, and she had come recommended by no one because she had no one to recommend her. Her cousin Peter, who had brought her out from a boarding house in Pella, Iowa, where she had landed 9 months earlier from a ship out of Groningen, had left 3 weeks prior with a harvest crew headed west toward the Missouri Breaks. He said he would send word. He had not. Greer's accusation was not loud. It was quiet and flat, and delivered in the space between 2 sentences the way a man delivers something he has already decided on. He said the rice was missing. He said it had been there the night before. He looked at Maren when he said it, and that look was the verdict. Maren understood the words. She had been learning English in fragments since she arrived, picking up the language the way a person picks up stones from a riverbed one at a time, turning each over to see what it was worth. She understood missing and taking and get your things. What she could not do in the 3 minutes between the accusation and the locked door was assemble a defense in a language that still lived in the front of her mouth instead of in her chest, where language needs to live if it is going to fight. The door locked. The foreman went inside. She stood in the November morning with a cracked wooden trunk at her feet, a spade leaning against the bunkhouse wall, and $11.40 in her coat pocket. She was 16 years old. She had no family within 500 miles. She had no letter of reference, no second pair of boots, and no fare back to Pella. What she had was the trunk, one wool blanket that smelled of lanolin and someone else's sweat, a dull spade with a crack in the socket, a hand axe whose handle had split and been wrapped with baling wire, and the small notebook bound in oilcloth that had belonged to her mother. Her mother had died in Drenthe when Maren was 12. The notebook was written in Dutch in a hand Maren could still hear when she read it. It contained sketches of walls, roof lines, drainage cuts, and peat stacking patterns her mother had learned from her own mother, who had built and repaired pit shelters in the sandy heathlands east of the Veluwe. None of that seemed to matter now. What mattered was November. The town of Armour sat on a plain so flat that a person could watch the horizon in every direction without a single thing interrupting it. The railroad had arrived 2 years earlier and brought with it lumber, coal nails, glass, a telegraph line, a depot, stockyards, and the firm belief that civilization was something you could ship by rail and nail together over a weekend. The buildings along the main street were frame construction. Pine boards from Minnesota mills nailed together, fast painted when someone had the money for paint. They looked solid from a distance. They were not solid. Maren had spent 6 weeks repairing rail ties and watching those buildings in the evening light. She had seen them sway in gusts that came from the northwest with nothing between them and the Canadian border. She had lain in the bunkhouse at night and listened to the walls breathe and felt snow dust come through seams that had been caulked in October and failed by the first week of November. She understood even then that those buildings were fighting the wind instead of sheltering from it, and she understood that fighting the wind on an open prairie was a war no wall could win. But understanding did not feed her. Understanding did not give her a place to sleep when the temperature kept dropping and the ground was already beginning to harden underfoot. She sat on her trunk outside the general store and did the arithmetic again. A basic shanty, the cheapest kind a person could build, 12 feet by 14 single wall boards and a tar paper roof cost approximately $40 if a person bought smart and did all the work herself. Lumber alone was $15 for the 600 board feet she would need. A used stove cost between $3 and $5. Nails were 8 cents a pound. Tar paper was $1.20 a roll. She had $11.40. She did not have enough to build the door. A sod house was cheaper. Sod cost nothing if a person cut it herself. But even a simple soddy needed a roof, and a sod roof needed timber for rafters, and the nearest timber worth the name grew along the James River bottoms, 20 miles east. Hauling it alone without a wagon or a team was not a task. It was a sentence, and the sentence was written in cold. Gideon Brant found her there sitting on the trunk with the arithmetic behind her eyes. Brant was 58 years old, built like a fence post that had survived 30 winters, and he walked with a slight drag in his left leg from years of uneven ground. He had come to Dakota from Ohio after the war, built claim shanties for settlers who paid slowly or not at all, and developed the habit of saying exactly what he thought in the fewest possible words. He had watched Maren on the section gang. He had watched her drive a spike maul with her whole body because she did not yet have the shoulders to drive it with her arms alone. He had said nothing then. He said nothing about most things unless the situation required it. He stopped in front of her trunk and looked at the spade and the hand axe and the coins still held loosely in her fist. "Greer put you out," he said. It was not a question. Maren nodded. "The rice. I did not take it." Brant looked at the sky the way men on the prairie looked at the sky. Not casually, but with the seriousness of reading a clock that only moves in one direction. "You have money for a ticket east, I have $11. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved down the street and lifted a scrap of paper from the boardwalk and carried it away without ceremony. Then he said, "You need a roof over your head. Walls that hold nails, a stove that draws clean and coal enough to last through March. That costs $40 at the low end. You don't have $40. And it costs 6 weeks of work you don't have either because the ground freezes hard in 3 weeks, and after that you cannot dig a post hole without dynamite." He paused. "You need to find work or find a family that will take you in through the winter." Maren looked at the spade. "There is a third choice," she said. Brant waited. "There is land nobody wants." He shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at something that cannot be reasoned with. "Land nobody wants is land that will kill you," he said. "That is not a choice. That is a longer way to die." He walked away. Maren watched him go. The sign above the general store creaked on its chains in the wind, and that was the only sound left on the street. The land nobody wanted was a 40-acre parcel on the southeast edge of Douglas County, where the ground dipped into a shallow basin that held water in spring sedge grass in summer and ice in winter. The locals called it different things. The polite name was the Wet 40. The common name was the Vanishing 40 because anything placed there, fence post, seed, ambition, had a way of disappearing into mud or failure or both. A land speculator named Aldous Red had acquired it 2 years earlier as part of a larger plan involving a railroad spur extension that had since gone north instead of east. The parcel sat on his books like a bruise he could not stop pressing. He was 39 years old, sharp-faced and deliberate, and he operated from a desk in the back of the hardware store, buying distressed claims and selling land on installment to settlers who arrived with hope and left with debt. He had a manner that made people feel they were getting a bargain until they understood, usually too late, that they were not. He looked at Maren the way a man looks at something too small to factor into his plans. $9, he said. No survey guarantee, no road access, no drainage easement, no timber rights, because there is no timber. The deed transfers as a private sale. I'll file it with the clerk. He leaned back in his chair. You understand that a minor holding land in Dakota Territory has no settled legal protection. Any adult creditor with a financial interest can challenge the transfer. Any court will consider the challenge seriously. I understand. You understand that if you miss county tax, I can petition to void the sale and recover the parcel. I understand. Then why are you buying a swamp? Maren set $9 on the desk. She kept $2.40. She said, because nobody else wants it. Red took the money. He wrote the receipt in a hand so precise it looked like the ink was irritated at the paper. He filed the deed with Prescott, the town clerk, who told Maren in a low voice that the sale was thin as creek ice and that Red would come back for the land the moment it suited him. Maren nodded. She folded the deed into the oilcloth notebook and walked out of the hardware store with $2.40, a trunk, a blanket, a spade, a hand axe, and 40 acres of ground that no one in Armored Dakota Territory believed would support a fence post, let alone a life. She had bought nothing except a legal fiction and a piece of earth that other men used as a punchline. Winter was 3 weeks away. What Maren did not know when she walked out of that hardware store was that Aldous Red did not wait for winter. He was a man who had made his living understanding leverage. He understood that money was not the only thing a person needed to survive in a new place. A person needed goodwill. Goodwill was neighbors willing to trade work for food. Goodwill was a woman who let you fill a water pail from her well. Goodwill was a family that passed word of odd jobs in your direction when they had more than they needed. Red understood all of this, and he understood something else. He held the notes on 3 families who had been considering hiring Maren for the season. Not large notes, small ones, the kind that settle themselves quietly over a season when everything goes right. But notes were notes, and a note in Red's hand was a fact that did not care about the weather. Within 24 hours of Maren's purchase, he called those notes in early. Not loudly, not publicly. He sent a single message to each family, an account statement with a number circled and a date underlined. Nothing threatening, just arithmetic. The arithmetic said there was no room in the budget for outside labor this season. The arithmetic said every spare dollar needed to come back to the desk in the hardware store before the ground froze. The families complied. They did not do it willingly. They did it the way people do things when they owe money to a patient man with excellent records. One woman who had offered Maren hauling work told her the arrangement had changed. She looked at the ground when she said it. Another man who had work that needed doing said he had already found someone. He did not look at Maren at all. A third family sent their oldest son to say they were sorry, but there it was. Maren understood what was happening. She did not yet have the English words for all of it, but she understood the shape of it. The doors were closing. Not because of the weather and not because of Edwin Greer's accusation. They were closing because someone with a pen and a ledger had decided they should. She had $2.40. She had 40 acres of ground the county had classified as unimprovable wetland. And she had a notebook and oilcloth that contained the handwriting of a woman who had learned to build warmth out of the earth itself. She walked to the edge of the slough on the afternoon she bought the land and stood on the dry shoulder of the basin where the ground rose about 3 feet above the water line in a low hummock thick with dead sedge. She pressed the heel of her boot into the earth. The surface was firm, but beneath it the ground gave slightly the way a living thing gives when pressed. She opened the notebook to the page with the wall cross-section. She traced the layers with one finger. Clay, peat sod, clay again, sod root side down, sod root side up. She looked at the hummock. The sedge roots were thick as a woven mat, dense and interlocked and running horizontal through the earth in a way that held the whole surface together like skin. She would not build up. Every building in Armour was built up walls rising straight from the ground to meet the wind head-on, and the wind met them back without hesitation, and the buildings shook and leaked and bled heat through every gap. She had watched them from the bunkhouse and understood even then that they were fighting the wrong fight. She would build down and over, a shallow pit on the dry shoulder of the hummock just deep enough to drop below the wind. A low frame with a slope that started near ground level and rose only enough for a person to sit upright at the ridge. Over the frame, willow brush from the slow edge, then reed matting, then a layer of clay pressed by hand into every seam, and over all of it turf. Blocks of root-bound sedge cut from the dry rim, laid root-side down for the first course, and root-side up for the second, staggered the way scales overlap on a fish. Thick on the windward side, thicker still before January. A entry tunnel facing southeast away from the northwest wind, bent at a right angle halfway through like a fox den, so the cold air could not follow the turn. The materials were under her feet. The knowledge was in the notebook. The only thing she lacked was time, and time on the Dakota prairie in November was the one thing that could not be purchased. She opened the trunk and took out the spade. The first morning, the blade went in cleanly. The earth near the hummock was still soft enough to cut, and the sedge roots gave way in thick, heavy blocks that smelled of iron and cold water. Maren cut blocks and stacked them on the rim. She cut the pit itself 8 feet wide and 14 feet long with a drainage groove at the low end angled just enough to carry water away from where she would sleep. The work was harder than section labor because there was no one beside her setting the pace, no rhythm to follow, no whistle that marked the end of the shift. There was only the spade and the ground and the growing pile of dark blocks and the sky getting colder by the day. She had been at it 2 hours when Rufus Carr stopped his freight wagon on the stock path that ran along the slough edge. Rufus was 17, freckled, and had the forearms of someone who had been hauling loads since before he was strong enough for them. He drove between Armour and the Dutch farms south of Plankinton twice a week and had opinions about nearly everything he passed on the road. He climbed down and walked to the edge of the pit. He looked at the hole and the dirt pile and the girl standing in mud to her shins with a spade wrapped in baling wire. "What are you building?" he said. "A house." Rufus looked around at the flat ground and the slough and the dead sedge and the complete absence of anything resembling lumber. Out of what Maren cut another block. Pressed it between her palms. It held springy and fibrous. She placed it on the keeper pile. "The ground," she said. Rufus looked at the dark, root-matted block she had set down. He turned it over in his hands. Mud smeared across his palm. "You're building a house out of dirt, out of turf. The roots hold it. Roots rot. Not if they stay dry on the inside." He dropped the block back on the pile the way a person puts something down when they have made up their mind. He climbed back onto the wagon. "You're 16 and you're digging your own grave," he said. He drove away, shaking his head, and the sound of the wagon faded into the grass, and then there was only the wind. Maren went back to cutting. Act 2. She needed to sharpen the spade. The blade was dull enough that the cut blocks came up ragged too thick on one side and crumbling on the other, and a crumbling block would not hold its shape in a roof. A whetstone cost 10 cents. She had $2.40, and every coin was already counted against something else. She kept cutting. The gossip started within the week. At the general store, a man named Hadley said he had seen the Dutch girl digging herself a grave out by the bog. Orrin Sachs, the blacksmith, refused to extend credit for nails when Maren came asking, and he told 3 other men within earshot that he did not lend to someone building a hole and calling it a house. Children from the school took a dare to run to the slough edge and knock on what they called the mud coffin, though there was nothing yet to knock on because the roof had not been started. The phrase that traveled farthest came from Red himself. He rode out to the slough on a Tuesday afternoon with Prescott beside him, and he sat on his horse and looked down at the pit and the block pile and the girl standing in it with a cracked spade and a cut on her palm wrapped in a strip of wool. He said it without raising his voice. "A child cannot make a farm out of a swamp, and a swamp cannot make a person." Maren looked up at him from the pit. Her face was drawn. The cut on her hand had soaked through the wrapping. She said, "Then you have lost nothing by waiting." The line landed quietly. Prescott shifted in his saddle. Red's expression did not change, but something behind it moved slightly the way light moves behind a cloud without the cloud shifting. He leaned forward and spoke carefully the way a man speaks when he wants the words remembered. "If you miss county tax," he said, "or if you create any hazard near the stock path, I will petition to void this transfer and recover this land. And you will be exactly what Greer said you were, a girl too slow to hold what she's been given. He turned the horse. Winter will do my work for me. They rode back towards town. Maren stood in the pit and watched them go until the sound of the horses dissolved into the sound of the grass, and the grass dissolved into the wind, and the wind was the only thing left. She went back to work. But Red had not ridden out only to speak. Within the week, 3 families who might still have offered Maren occasional work, hauling fence repair, wood splitting, found their accounts at the hardware store flagged for imminent review. Red did not tell them to avoid the girl at the slough. He did not need to. When a man's credit is under review, he does not go looking for new expenses. The woman who had let Maren fill a water pail from her well came to the door and said the well was running low and looked at the ground while she said it. Another family sent their oldest son to tell Maren there was no work this season, and they were sorry, but there it was. Nobody wanted trouble with Red. Red held notes. Red bought claims. Red sat in the back of the hardware store and decided which settlers got a second chance and which did not. Standing up for a Dutch girl's dirt digging was not a bargain anyone in armor was prepared to make. Maren ate what she could find. Cattail roots from the slough edge, which tasted like wet paper and had to be roasted over a fire small enough that the smoke would not draw attention. A prairie hen she snared with a loop of baling wire, cooked over coals and eaten to the bone. She lost weight. Her coat hung loose at the shoulders. Her hands blistered and split and healed crooked and blistered again. The cut on her palm leaked for 4 days before it crusted into a scar she would carry the rest of her life. And still she cut turf. Every morning before the light came fully up, every evening, until she could not see her hands, she cut blocks from the dry rim of the slough, pressed each one between her palms, and kept only the ones that held firm and fibrous. The rest she threw left. The discard pile grew faster than the keeper pile and would remain larger for a long time. She did not stop discarding. A bad block in a roof was a hole waiting to happen, and holes were what the cold found first. Her mother had not been a soft woman. Maren Velde had built in hard ground and cold seasons with the understanding that the earth did not give up its warmth for free. You had to earn it. You had to know what you were asking for and ask the right way. The notebook was full of that understanding. It was in every dimension, every notation, every small diagram of how the layers work together to hold heat inside and keep cold outside. Cold finds the holes before it finds the door. Maren read that line every night before she slept, lying in the pit, with the blanket pulled over her and the trunk blocking the entry gap and the stars visible through the unfinished roof above. The stars were bright and very cold and very far away, and they did not care about the arithmetic, and they did not care about Red's ledger, and they did not care about the gossip in the general store. She pressed her palm flat against the earth wall at the pit's edge. Cold on the surface, dry and close to warm 2 inches in. The walls of the bunkhouse had breathed the wind because they were hollow and thin and standing upright against a force that had all the time in the world. This wall did not breathe. It simply existed the way the earth existed, without apology and without effort and without any intention of giving ground. She was not building a house. She was building a piece of the earth with a door in it. The ridgepole went in on the 9th day. 2 scrap saplings lashed together with wire and seated in notched posts at either end of the pit. The frame was not straight and not elegant and not anything Gideon Brant would have called sound. But it held when she hung her full weight on it. It held when the wind gusted that night. It held. She began weaving willow branches over the frame, each one worked into the next, the way a basket is woven, so the surface formed a continuous mat rather than a scatter of sticks. Over the willow went the first layer of reed matting, dried cattail, and sedge stalks bundled flat and tied. Over the reed went clay pressed by hand into every gap and seam. Her hands turned black with it. The turf went on last, root side down for the first course pressed into the clay. Root side up for the second staggered so the seams never aligned vertically. She had cut perhaps 40 good blocks. She needed at minimum 200 more. The windward face, the northwest side, the direction every hard thing came from on this prairie, needed to be thickest and tightest and most unforgiving. She worked alone. She ate alone. She slept in the pit with the blanket pulled over her and the notebook set on the trunk lid where she could reach it in the dark. And the ground was hardening. Each morning the spade went a fraction less deep. Each morning the roots resisted a fraction more. The clock was not ticking. The clock was freezing, and when it froze completely, whatever she had built by then was all she would have between herself and the worst the prairie could send. She was 16 years old. She was alone on 40 acres of ground that every person in armor considered either worthless or dangerous, or both. She had $2.30 and a notebook full of her dead mother's handwriting and a pile of good turf blocks that was still smaller than the pile of bad ones she had thrown away. And winter was 3 weeks out, and the spade was growing harder to drive each morning, and Aldous Red was sitting at his desk in the back of the hardware store with the deed challenge already written and a patience that had never once failed him. On the afternoon he rode out and delivered his speech from horseback and turned back toward town. The wind followed him. It came from the northwest, which was always the direction the hard things came from. It moved across the open ground without obstacle and without hurry, and it found the pit, and it moved over the low ridge of the unfinished roof and pressed down into the gap at the windward face where the turf coverage stopped halfway across. Maren felt it on the back of her neck, cold and direct, like a hand placed flat between her shoulder blades. She pulled another block from the stack, pressed it between her palms. It held. She placed it on the roof. She packed clay into the gap with her bare hands. She pressed turf into the clay. She smoothed the seam with her palm until the surface was continuous and the draft stopped. The wind moved over the top of the hummock and went on across the open plain without finding anything else to push against. She went back to cutting. Down the stock path toward town, Aldous Red rode at an easy pace, unhurried and certain. He had pulled the notes. He had closed the doors. He had spoken the words clearly enough that Prescott would remember them and pass them along, and the town would understand that the girl at the slough had no allies and no credit and no future on that land. He had the deed challenge ready in his desk drawer. He would file it when the moment was right, and the moment he was confident would come before spring. He did not look back at the slough. If he had, he would have seen a figure standing at the edge of the pit in the fading afternoon light, pulling another block from a pile, pressing it between two cracked and mud-blackened hands, placing it onto a roof that was still half-finished and might not be finished in time, and that every experienced person who had seen it had already decided would fail. But Red did not look back. He rode toward town. And Maren Velde went back to work. The man who stopped on the stock path did not stop because of the hole. Anyone could dig a hole. The Dakota prairie was full of holes, some of them graves, some of them ambitions, and the difference between the two was not always clear until spring. What made Barnard stop his wagon and set the brake and climb down onto the frozen ground was something smaller and more specific than a hole. It was the pile beside the hole. There were two piles. One was dark and dense and wet-looking, the color of river mud after 3 days of rain. The other was lighter, springier, a color closer to dry straw than to earth. And the girl in the pit was throwing blocks onto the dark pile without looking at them twice, and placing blocks onto the light pile with both hands carefully, the way a person places something that has taken effort to find. She was rejecting more than she was keeping, by a wide margin. Barnard stood on the path and watched for 10 minutes. Maren did not notice him, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. The spade rose and fell. A block came up. She pressed it between her palms. Dark water ran between her fingers. She threw it left. Another block. She pressed it. It bent and sprang back. No water. She set it right. He walked down the bank. He picked up one of the rejected blocks and pressed it between his own palms. Water ran over his wrists, brown and cold. He picked up one of the kept blocks and pressed it. It held. He pressed harder. It gave slightly and recovered. He said in Dutch, "You are not piling dirt. You are choosing skin." Maren looked up. She had not heard Dutch spoken in weeks. The sound of it moved through her the way cold water moves through a hot room, sudden and complete, and changing the temperature of everything it touched. The vowels sat in the back of the throat the way her mother's voice had sat, and for a moment the slough and the prairie and the pale November sky all went very still. "My mother built this way," she said, also in Dutch. "In Drenthe, yes." Barnard set the block down. He walked to the trunk where the oilcloth notebook sat open, weighted with a stone. He studied the page for a long time without touching it, the cross-section drawing, the layering notation, the small, careful handwriting. She learned from someone who knew the ground, he said, from her mother. Barnard closed the notebook gently, the way a person closes something that belongs to someone else. He looked at the half-finished roof, the windward face where the turf coverage stopped midway across. He looked at the entry, still an open gap with the trunk shoved into it as a temporary block. He looked at the sky with the seriousness of a man reading a document he did not write but understood completely. He was 64 years old. He had come to Dakota with the Douglas County Dutch colony years earlier, walking in off the Plankinton platform with a ditching spade and the specific knowledge of a man who had spent his life managing water and soil and the spaces between them. His wife Alcha had died the second winter. He had stayed because grief on the prairie was a luxury the ditches would not permit. He rolled up his sleeves. His forearms were roped with old muscle and older scars. "Show me where you are cutting from," he said. "I will show you where you should be cutting from." He did not move into the shelter. He built a lean-to from scrap boards against the windward face of the hummock 50 paces from the pit and slept there through the cold nights with the wind moving over him directly. Maren understood later that he stayed close because the situation required it and that he slept outside because he wanted to hear the wind without a roof muting it. A man who had spent 40 years understanding how water and cold moved through the earth did not stop listening to them when he lay down for the night. The first thing he taught was the squeeze test, which Maren had already taught herself but had not yet named. He took her to the northeast rim of the slough where the ground rose slightly, and the sedge grew in a band about 40 feet wide between the wet center and the dry open prairie. He cut a block and pressed it between his palms. It bent. It recovered. No water. He moved 10 feet toward the water and cut another block. It smeared between his hands, dark paste oozing through every finger. "Cut from the band," he said. "Never from the wet center. The roots in the band run horizontal. They weave. They bind. A block from here will hold together for years. A block from there is porridge, and you are not roofing with porridge." Maren had already been cutting from the dry rim, but not consistently and not always from the best part of the rim. After that morning, she cut only from the band. Her keeper pile grew faster. The discard pile grew slower. The difference was visible by the end of the second day. The second thing Barnard taught was the overlap. He climbed onto the half-finished roof and pointed at a seam where 2 blocks met edge-to-edge vertical seam, aligning with the vertical seam of the course below. He pulled the blocks apart with both hands and held them up. "Water follows a seam," he said, "the way thread follows a needle. It enters at the top, moves down, reaches the clay layer, sits there until it freezes, then expands and pushes the seam wider. By February, the seam is a channel. By March, the channel is a leak. By April, the leak is a collapse." He relayed the blocks with a 6-inch stagger. "Never let the vertical seams align," he said. "Not once. Not anywhere. If I find an aligned seam on this roof, I will pull it apart myself and make you lay it again." Maren said nothing. She went back to the pile and began resetting 3 courses she had laid too quickly in the first week. The third thing Barnard taught was the smoke cure. This came later when the roof was further along, but it changed her understanding of the whole structure in a way the first 2 lessons had not. He built a small fire inside the shelter using damp grass and green willow bark, and she understood within 2 minutes why he had used those materials instead of dry ones. The smoke was thick and bitter and filled the interior completely. Her eyes burned. She moved toward the entry. "Stay," Barnard said. "I cannot breathe. Your roof cannot breathe either, and that is what we are correcting. The smoke dries the inner surface without heat. Heat cracks the clay. Heat curls the reed. Smoke is slow and patient, and it reaches into every gap that the clay missed. Run these fires 3 times before hard cold arrives and the inner face becomes a shell. Rain hits the outer turf. Snow sits on the outer turf. But the inner shell stays dry because we baked it while we had the chance." Maren stayed. Her eyes streamed. The smoke moved along the underside of the roof like something alive, pressing into every reed, every seam, every place where the clay had not quite sealed. When they opened the entry flap and the vent hole together, the smoke poured out in a column that turned gray in the afternoon light. Barnard said, "Press your palm to the inner roof." She pressed it against the underside of the first turf course. The reed mat had stiffened. The clay layer had tightened and smoothed into a surface that felt less like packed mud and more like old plaster, warm and dry and continuous. "Your mother would have known this," Barnard said. "The women who built the pit shelters in Drenthe cured their roofs with smoke before every winter. It is not a secret. It is patience that looks like a secret to people who have none." The weeks became a rhythm. Cut in the morning when the ground was softest. Stack and drain through midday. Lay in the afternoon while the light held. Smoke cure in the evening. Eat whatever the slough and the surrounding ground offered up. Cattail roots. A prairie hen. Once a half sack of cracked wheat that appeared near the stock path one morning, with no explanation left by someone who would not have admitted to leaving it under any circumstances. Rufus Carr left that wheat. He also left 2 bent iron rods near the road salvage from a broken wagon brake, and Barnard showed Maren how to drive them through the upper turf courses and into the frame below, locking the blocks against wind lift that could peel a poorly anchored roof the way a person peels bark from a green branch. Progress had a shape. The windward side reached 18 inches of coverage in the first week with Barnard. The leeward side went on thinner because the southeast face caught less wind and the block supply was not yet sufficient to match both faces. The entry tunnel took form in the third week, a low crawl 2 feet high and 4 feet long, bent at a right angle halfway through, with Maren's blanket hung at the interior end as a temporary flap. She slept cold until Barnard produced a second blanket and said only I had 2. One warm night in late November, a soft rain fell, which was not unusual in itself, but carried within it a temperature that hovered just above freezing and pressed down on the half-finished leeward corner of the roof with a weight the frame was not yet ready to handle. Maren heard it in the dark. Not a crash. A sound like a man settling heavily into a chair, low and definitive, followed by the wet smell of opened earth. She crawled out to find one corner of the leeward roof had given way. Not catastrophically, but completely. The blocks had slid inward and the clay seal had cracked along the diagonal, and cold water was running down the inner wall in a thin sheet that had already soaked the floor below it. She repacked clay with her bare hands in the dark and stacked the fallen blocks back and held them there while the clay dried enough to grip, and her hands were numb to the wrist by the time the seal held. In the morning, she reshaped the corner, adding 2 additional roof pins and a fresh clay smear over the entire face. Gideon Brant came that afternoon. He stood at the edge of the pit and looked at the repacked corner and the handprints in the fresh clay and the girl on her knees checking the seam above the repair. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "That is why men use boards." "Boards would have blown off," Maren said. She did not look up. "Boards don't melt. Boards don't stop wind either." Brant was quiet. He looked at the ridgepole, which had bowed slightly under the weight of the wet turf on the windward face. He looked at it the way a carpenter looks at a problem he has already solved in his head before speaking it aloud. "Your ridge is bowing," he said. "If it sags another inch, the whole north face will slide." Maren looked up. "Don't read into it," Brant said. "I have a cedar post I don't need and a roof that is going to fail if it doesn't get a center support. Those are separate facts." He brought the cedar post that afternoon and drove it himself with a mallet from his workshop, shimming the base with a wedge cut from scrap oak until the ridge straightened and held. He did not examine the smoke-cured inner surface for long before turning away, but he examined it for longer than a man looks at something he has already dismissed. He left without saying anything else. By the end of December, the shelter was finished. From the stock path, it looked like nothing a person would choose. A low, dark shape pressed against the hummock turf, browned and then frozen, a skim of snow covering the outer surface until the whole form blended with the ground around it. The entry was a dark gap at ground level, partly screened by dead sedge, requiring a person to drop to hands and knees and navigate the dogleg tunnel before reaching the wool flap inside. Within the shelter, small, dark smelling of cured reed and cold clay and the faint iron tang of the stove. The floor was packed earth covered with dry grass. The sleeping shelf, a raised platform of scrap boards and bundled sedge, sat against the warmest wall opposite the entry, where the stove radiated heat into the banked earth behind it. The ceiling at the ridge was just high enough for Maren to sit upright. In early January, she ran a test. She filled a tin pail with water and set it on the sleeping shelf before banking the stove for the night. She filled a second pail and asked Brant to set it inside his tool shed frame, built with board walls and a shingled roof. In the morning, she crawled through the tunnel and checked the shelf. The water was cold but liquid. A film of ice clung to the pail's rim nearest the outer wall, but the center had not frozen. She walked to Brant's shed. The pail had skinned over completely. A 1/4 inch of ice covered the surface. Brant looked at his pail. He looked at Maren. He said, "Only the earth holds heat like that." He did not say she had been right. He did not need to. The pail said it. January arrived strangely. Warm days followed brutal nights in a pattern that felt less like weather and more like something undecided. Snow fell and melted and fell again. The ground softened and refroze in cycles that cracked fence posts and split water barrels. Old men at the general store said the weather did not know what season it was. They said it with the forced lightness of people who were afraid of something they could not name. The real danger was not the cold. The real danger was the warmth. A warm day in January on the Dakota prairie tells a person the worst is finished. It says, "Come outside." It says the storm season has passed and the long wait for spring is shorter than you feared. It makes women hang laundry on the line and open windows that have been sealed since November. It puts men on the roads without blankets under the wagon seat. It sends children to school without their heavy coats because the sun is warm enough to melt the icicles hanging from the eaves, and surely that means the cold is broken. The prairie has never once finished with its worst. January 12th dawned mild. The air carried almost no bite in it. Snow from the previous week softened into slush along the south-facing walls of every building and armor. Barnard walked to the stock path to stretch his legs. Maren opened the entry flap to let the shelter breathe. In town, men went to the hardware store without buttoning their coats. At the schoolhouse south of town, the teacher let the children play outside during the noon hour because the sun had come out and the yard was clear and there was no reason in the world not to. By early afternoon, the sky changed. It did not change the way storms usually begin, with clouds building from the west and the light dimming in stages over the course of an hour. It changed all at once. The northwest horizon turned black. Not dark, not gray, not the deep blue of an approaching storm front. Black as though someone had drawn a line across the sky with ink and erased everything behind it. The wind from the south stopped. For perhaps 2 minutes the air was completely still. The slough ice did not creak. The sedge along the bank did not move. A crow that had been calling somewhere to the east went silent. Then the line reached them. The temperature dropped so fast that the moisture in the air crystallized before it could fall. Snow did not descend from the sky. Snow appeared in the air everywhere at once, as though the atmosphere itself had turned to ice and shattered. The wind came behind it. Not a gust. A wall. A physical force that struck a standing person sideways and filled the lungs with crystals so fine they felt like breathing ground glass. Within 15 minutes, Maren could not see the slough from the entry of the shelter. Within 30 minutes, she could not see her hand at arm's length. The world was gone. There was only wind and white, and a sound like a freight train running on a track with no end. She sealed the entry flap. She fed the stove with small, careful twists of dry grass and peat. Not a large fire. A steady managed one enough to keep the iron warm without overheating the small space. The smoke hole backdrafted once as the wind found the opening and tried to force itself down. She remembered Barnard's instruction and opened the lower vent at the base of the entry tunnel, creating a draw from below that pulled the smoke upward despite the pressure from above. The backdraft cleared. The stove settled. The roof groaned. A low sound, deep as a man shifting in his sleep as the wind pressed against the outer surface and the frozen turf resisted. But the wind could not find an edge. It passed over the slope the way water passes over a smooth stone, finding nothing to grip, no vertical face, no seam to enter at an angle. The shelter did not shake. It did not rattle. Boards and armor were rattling. Every frame building in town was a drum being struck by a force that had crossed 500 miles of open plain to reach it. Maren's shelter was silent except for the low groan of the turf settling tighter against itself. Then someone hit the door. Not a knock. An impact. The sound of a body striking the wool flap and the frozen turf around it, a dull, heavy blow followed by a scrabbling sound, fingers or boots or both trying to dig through the entry wall. Maren grabbed the hemp rope she had tied to the center post and wrapped it twice around her waist. She pulled the flap aside. Snow drove into the tunnel like a thrown fist. She crawled through the dog leg on her hands and knees with the rope paying out behind her and reached the outer opening. Rufus Carr was on his knees in the snow. His face was white from the jaw to the cheekbones. The ice crystals had cut the exposed skin above the scarf raw and red. His hands would not close. Behind him, barely visible through the white, two small shapes huddled against the hummock pressed into the lee of the earthen wall. Rufus had been driving Ada and Orrin Hewitt home from the schoolhouse when the storm hit. The horse bolted. The wagon overturned somewhere between the road and open prairie, and directions ceased to exist the moment the wind arrived. He had carried Ada and dragged Orrin. He had walked toward the low black mound he had mocked for 2 months because it was the only thing he could picture clearly enough to walk toward. He had found it by falling against it. Maren pulled Rufus through the tunnel first, hauling on the rope with both hands, and went back out for the children. Ada was burning with fever even through the cold, her skin hot and dry against Maren's hand. Orrin was 9 and had been pressing himself flat against the outer wall to give his sister some shelter from the wind, and he did not speak when Maren reached him, just moved when she pulled him. She got both children through the tunnel. Then she heard a sound from the open prairie behind her. Not a voice. A dragging sound. Something heavy moving slowly through the drifted snow 20 feet out, 30 feet, no direction visible. She went back out on the rope. Barnard Call had gone looking for the wagon when he heard it overturn. He had walked into the storm because Rufus Carr and 2 children were somewhere in it, and he had spent 40 years on the prairie and had never once left someone to the wind when he could still stand. He could still stand barely when Maren found him. His coat was torn open on one side where the wind had ripped the buttons clean through the fabric. His lips were blue. The ice had crusted his beard into a solid mass. She pulled him by the arms. The rope held. The tunnel held. The entry, crusted now with packed snow that had built itself into additional insulation around the outer face, held. 5 people in a space built for one. Maren placed Barnard against the warmest wall. Not the wall nearest the stove, which radiated direct heat, but the wall behind the stove where the earth itself had been absorbing warmth since December, storing it the way the earth stores summer against the coming of winter. She had read that positioning in the notebook. Her mother had written it in the margins beside a diagram. The stored wall is warmer than the burning one. Put the coldest person against the stored wall. She stripped Barnard's wet coat and covered him with the blanket he had given her weeks before and pressed him flat against the earth. She fed the stove, fed the small twists of fuel every 20 minutes, not enough to waste, not so little that the stored heat in the walls began to bleed away. The smoke hole drew. The vent held. The entry flap packed with driven snow on the outside that served as insulation she had not planned for, but that the design absorbed without complaint, held against every gust that tried to find a way through the dogleg. Outside armor was failing. The railroad section house lost heat so fast the men inside burned the wooden benches. A family 3 miles north in a single-wall claim shanty burned their chair legs when the coal ran out, and when the chair legs were gone, they burned the table, and when the table was gone, they sat in the dark and listened to the walls sing in the cold. A section hand froze between the depot and the bunkhouse 40 yards found in the morning. Gideon Brandt left his shop at dusk with a lantern and a rope tied to his fence post and walked toward the slough. He made it perhaps 200 yards before the lantern blew out and the rope ran out, and the world became a void with no floor and no ceiling and no direction. He pressed himself behind a haystack on the Hadley property and waited through the night with the cold taking his fingers and his ears in stages. He survived because the haystack blocked the wind, the way Maren's turf blocked the wind, not with strength but with mass. It would cost him the tips of 2 fingers on his left hand and the feeling in his right ear permanently. He would not know about the shelter until morning. Inside the turf house, the night passed in units measured by the stove. Feed. Check the vent. Feed. Check the children. Feed. Check Barnard. The pail on the sleeping shelf did not freeze. Ada's fever broke sometime before dawn, not because of medicine, but because the air inside was warm enough to let her body fight, and her body fought, and the warmth held. Orrin slept pressed against the earth wall with his knees drawn up. Rufus sat with his back against the opposite wall and worked his hands open and closed with the deliberate grimness of a man who has been told to keep moving and intends to. Barnard opened his eyes once in the deepest part of the night. He looked at the curved ceiling above him, the smoke-cured reed mat, dark and dry and continuous. He felt the earth behind his back dense and close and warm in the specific way that only the stored earth is warm. He said in Dutch 2 words, "Your mother's house." Then he closed his eyes again. Morning came without sunrise. The snow continued, but the wind had diminished from a freight train to a low constant pressure, something leaning rather than striking. Maren opened the entry and crawled out through a drift that had packed itself nearly solid over the outer opening. She punched through it with her fist and climbed out into a world made entirely of white. The slough was gone. The hummock was gone. The stock path was gone. The fence line along the Hadley property to the east was gone. Everything flat had been made more flat by the snow, and everything that had stood upright was either buried or broken. The shelter was a low curve in an infinite blank field. Nothing more. The wind had found no wall to strike, no seam to enter, no edge to lift. It had passed over the shape the way it passed over the earth itself, because the shape was the earth and the earth did not break. Maren stood on the roof. The turf was solid beneath her boots. The snow lay over it in a smooth, unbroken layer, not piled against it the way snow piled against vertical surfaces, but draped over it, gently following the slope of the roof down to the ground on either side. She looked toward Armor. Smoke rose from some of the chimneys, not all of them. She stood on the roof of the shelter she had built from the ground of a swamp that no one in that town had believed could hold a fence post, and she counted the chimneys that had no smoke, and she understood what the gaps meant. Below her 4 people were alive. Below her in town not everyone was. She climbed back down and crawled through the tunnel and let the entry flap fall closed behind her, and inside the shelter the air was warm and close and smelled of reed smoke and wet wool and the iron of the stove. And Ada Hewitt was sitting up on the sleeping shelf, looking at the curved ceiling above her with the calm, unfocused expression of a child who has been very sick and has come back from it and does not yet know what that means. "Is the wind done?" Ada said. Maren knelt beside the stove and fed it a small twist of fuel. "Not yet," she said, "but it is tired." She set her hand flat against the earth wall beside the stove. She pressed it there and held it. The wall was cool on the surface. 2 inches in it was warm in the specific, dense, stored way that only the earth is warm, the way her mother had shown her by pressing a child's palm flat against a wall in Drenthe and saying, "Feel the difference." She felt it now. Outside, the wind moved across the plain and found the shelter and ran over the slope and went on without finding a place to enter. Rufus Carr walked into the general store on the afternoon of January 14th, with both hands wrapped in clean rags, and his face still carrying the cuts the ice crystals had opened 2 days before. There were 7 men in the store. Some of them had spent the storm behind a stove that could not keep pace with the heat leaving through their walls. Some of them had burned furniture. One of them had nailed blankets over his window frames when the caulking failed and had watched the blankets stiffen with frost an hour later. They were men who knew wood and nail and shingle, who had built or paid for buildings they trusted, and who had spent 2 days learning that what they trusted had not been enough. Rufus stood in front of them. He did not remove his hat. He held his wrapped hands out in front of him slightly, not as a gesture, just as a fact about where his hands were. "I called it a dirt coffin," he said. "I told her she was digging her own grave. I said that to her face, and I drove away laughing." Nobody spoke. He was not a man given to speeches. Everyone in the room knew that. He was a teamster who settled most conversations with a shrug and the rest with profanity. And when he said something plainly and sincerely, it carried the specific weight of a thing that has been earned rather than rehearsed. "Then the storm came," he said, "and I had 2 children and no horse and no direction and no building within reach, and the only thing I could picture in my mind clearly enough to walk toward was that mound of dirt I had spent 2 months laughing at. I walked toward it in a whiteout, and I found it by falling against it. And I crawled inside, and the wind went over us like it could not find a way in, because it could not." He paused. He looked at his hands. The water in the pail on the sleeping shelf did not freeze. The little Hewitt girl's fever broke without medicine. The old Dutchman lived through the night. He paused again. "I put my bare hand on the inner wall, and the wall was cool, not cold. There is a difference. In November, I could not have explained that difference to you. Now I can." Orrin Sachs, the blacksmith, who had refused Maren credit for nails, stood at the far end of the counter and looked at his own hands and said nothing. He looked at Rufus's wrapped hands and said nothing. He remained that way for a long time. Gideon Brandt came to the shelter 3 days after the storm. He walked slowly because the damage to his feet from the night behind the Hadley haystack had not yet resolved itself into something a man could ignore. The tips of 2 fingers on his left hand were black at the ends and would be removed to the first joint within the week. His right ear was white and numb and would stay that way. He had survived, but the survival had cost him in ways that were visible every time he moved, and he moved now with the deliberate care of a man who has learned recently what his body can and cannot absorb. He stood at the entry for a long time before he got down on his hands and knees and crawled through. He had to turn his shoulders sideways at the dogleg. He came through the wool flap and sat on the packed earth floor and looked around the way a carpenter looks at a structure he did not build and did not expect to respect. The curved ceiling above him, smoke-cured reed mat, dark and continuous and dry. The clay layer below the turf, smooth and sealed without a single crack he could see from where he sat. The sleeping shelf dry. The stove warm on a banked fire that had been burning low since dawn. The vent hole drawing clean. The entry tunnel behind him dog-legged and now packed with snow on the outside that had added insulation nobody planned for, and the design had absorbed without complaint. He pressed his palm flat against the inner wall and held it there. He held it there for a long time. "I told you dirt belonged under your boots," he said. He did not look at Maren. He looked at the wall. "I was wrong. Some of it belongs over your head." He said nothing else. He crawled back through the tunnel and stood up outside and brushed the snow from his coat knees. But he came back the next morning with his measuring string and spent an hour recording the dimensions of the entry, the pitch of the roof, the thickness of the turf at the windward face. He wrote the numbers in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. When Maren asked what the numbers were for, Brant said, "I build things. I need to understand why this one works." "It works because it does not fight the wind," Maren said. "Everything else in this town fights the wind. Everything fights the wind, not this. This lets the wind pass. The wind has nothing to push against. A tall wall is a target. A slope is invisible." Brant considered this the way a man considers something that contradicts the whole of his professional life but cannot be argued with on the basis of evidence. He was a carpenter. He had spent 30 years building vertical surfaces, right angles, peaked roofs, door frames designed to stand perpendicular to the earth and meet whatever came at them head-on. The idea that shelter could be achieved by refusing to stand up was not a thing he had ever been trained to understand. But his own hands told him what the haystack had done for him, and the haystack and the turf shelter operated on the same principle. Not strength, mass, low and indifferent to direction. He put his measuring book back in his pocket and left without saying anything further. But he did not laugh, and he had not laughed since he came back from the haystack, and the absence of laughter in a man who had laughed at the dirt coffin for 2 months was itself a kind of statement. Barnard Call did not recover. The cold had reached his lungs during the hours he spent in the storm looking for the overturned wagon, and what it found there was tissue that had already spent 40 years in hard winters and had very little reserve remaining. He stayed in the shelter through February, sleeping on the shelf Maren had built, eating what she cooked on the small stove and talking more than he had talked in years, as though the nearness of what was coming had loosened something in him that silence had held closed for a long time. He talked about Alcha, his wife who had died the second winter. She had planted a kitchen garden behind their dugout and grown onions in soil that other men said would grow nothing but grass. She grew onions the first year, carrots the second, potatoes the third. She said the prairie would grow whatever you asked it to if you asked in the right language. He said, "I never learned the language as well as she did." Maren listened. She kept the stove fed. She did not ask him to stop talking because the talking was not for her benefit. It was his, and she understood that. He was assembling something in words, putting it in order before the order became unavailable. He died on a Tuesday morning in the first week of March. The day was clear and cold. He asked Maren to open the entry flap so he could hear the wind. She opened it. The wind came in from the southeast, not the northwest, a different wind entirely carrying on it the first faint smell of what would eventually become spring. Wet grass somewhere far off, snow beginning to think about melting. Barnard breathed it in. He said in Dutch, "Water is the first carpenter. Make it work for you or it will take the house back." He said it the way her mother had said things, quietly, as though the information were a gift, offered without certainty that the recipient was ready for it. Then he closed his eyes and his breathing slowed, and the shelter was silent except for the wind in the entry tunnel and the faint tick of the stove cooling. Maren sat beside him for a long time. She did not speak. She closed the notebook, their notebook now hers and Barnard's, both pages of Dutch and pages of penciled corrections and pages of new designs they had argued over and drawn together. She wrapped it in the oilcloth and placed it in the trunk beside the spade and the hand axe and the blanket that had been Barnard's and was now hers because she had given her own to Willa Hewitt the morning after the storm and had not yet replaced it. The wind moved through the entry tunnel and touched the wool flap and stopped. Spring came the way it comes on the Dakota prairie, not gently. All at once, as though the earth had been holding its breath since October and could not hold it any longer. Snow melted in sheets. The slough rose. Meltwater moved downhill toward the lowest ground, and the lowest ground was a basin, and Aldous Red had been waiting for exactly this. He had said all winter in the hardware store, at the grain office, at every place where men gathered and talked, that mud was not a building material. He said it in the measured tone of a man who has no stake in the outcome, and is simply observing what any reasonable person could see. He said dirt dissolves. Every child knows this. The girl built a snowman out of sod, and spring will prove it. The first proof came from somewhere else. A German settler family named Hauer had copied Maren's design in the weeks after the blizzard, working fast and without instruction, building a low storm dugout on the north side of their claim. They had done the work in January when the ground was still frozen, and they had skipped the drainage trench because the frozen earth made digging a trench seem unnecessary, and the design on the scrap of paper Rufus had made from memory did not show a trench in a way they understood was mandatory. When the snow melted in March, the water moved across their site in a broad, shallow sheet and found the lowest point, which was the entry, and poured in. Within 2 days, the floor was 3 inches deep. The turf walls softened from below. The family moved out and told everyone at the general store that the Dutch girl's design was a fraud. Red said nothing publicly when he heard this. He smiled the way a man smiles when he has been patient for a long time and the patience has finally been rewarded. He let other people carry the story. He let Hadley repeat it and let the blacksmith shake his head and let the words spread the way words spread in a small town with nothing faster to travel on than the walk between buildings. Maren heard about the Hauer flooding on a Wednesday morning. She went to the site on Wednesday afternoon. She walked the ground first the way Barnard had taught her to walk any site before touching it. She read the grade. She saw the water's path from 40 feet uphill, following the natural slope to the lowest point. And the lowest point was the entry, because the entry faced slightly downhill, and the drainage trench had never been cut. The water had done exactly what water does. It had found the seam and followed it. The design had not failed. The drainage had never existed. She did not explain this at the general store. She did not stand in the street and give a speech. She took her spade and she cut the drainage trench herself, working the channel around the uphill perimeter of the shelter and directing the flow to a low point 30 feet south. She raised the entry sill with packed clay and coarse grass. She showed the Hauer family how to repack the lower wall courses with fresh turf root side out the way Barnard had shown her, so the roots would bind with the soil over the coming season and create a living seal that strengthened rather than weakened as time passed. She did all of this without speaking more than was necessary to demonstrate the work. She charged nothing. She took nothing. She did not explain herself to Red or to Hadley or to anyone else who had already decided what the Hauer flooding meant. When she was finished, she walked back to the slough. The following week, Vera Hewitt came to the shelter for the first time. Vera was 18, the oldest of the Hewitt children, and she had spent the winter managing the household while her mother worked. She was small and precise and wrote in a clean, practical hand that turned complicated things into numbered steps a person could follow without asking questions. She had not been in the shelter during the storm. She had been in town in a frame house that shook hard enough to send the dishes off the shelf, and she had spent the night counting the seconds between gusts and holding her youngest brother and not sleeping. She came because 3 families had asked Maren for written shelter diagrams, and Maren's written English was not yet equal to the technical language the instructions required. Maren could say squeeze test and stagger the seams and smoke cure 3 times. What she could not write in a way that a non-Dutch speaker could follow without her standing over them was why the drainage trench had to run at a specific grade, or why the entry tunnel needed a right-angle bend rather than a gradual curve, or why the clay layer had to go under the reed mat and not over it. Vera could write all of it. They worked on the sleeping shelf with the notebook between them. Maren speaking and Vera writing, and the work had the quality of a conversation in 2 directions at once. Vera translated Maren's knowledge into English that anyone could follow, and the act of translating it made Maren articulate things she had known in her hands but had never put into sentences before. Why the windward face needed to be thicker than the leeward. Why the blocks had to be cut from the dry band and never from the wet center. Why the smoke cure mattered in a way that no amount of sun drying could replicate. The notebook grew. It had 3 layers of handwriting now. Her mother's Dutch on the original pages, careful and small, fitting the whole of a knowledge into the least possible space. Barnard's pencil notations in the margins, angular and practical, the hand of a man who had spent 40 years communicating with other people's earth. And Vera's English in the new pages at the back, clean and numbered and precise, the hand of someone who understood that knowledge only travels as far as the language carrying it. Maren touched all 3 layers one evening before closing the notebook. 3 women's hands in a way, though Barnard would have disputed the categorization with a dignity that made the argument beside the point. 3 people who had understood the ground and tried to explain it to everyone else. Red filed the formal deed challenge in April. It was meticulous. He had spent months on it, and it showed. The legal framework was clear and narrow and correct on every point he raised. Maren Velde was a minor. Dakota territory law did not protect a minor's land holding with the force it protected an adult's. She had no legal guardian. She had no demonstrated income. The parcel was classified by the county's own survey as unimprovable wetland generating no agricultural value and no tax base sufficient to justify continued private holding by a party with no legal standing to defend it. He cited the purchase price, $9. He suggested the price itself spoke to the land's condition. He noted that the structures on the parcel built from soil and grass without permanent materials constituted no improvement of record and would not survive a standard property review. He did not mention the Howard flooding directly. He did not need to. The story was already in the room. The hearing took place above the general store on a Tuesday morning in late April. The room was warm with the first real heat of the year coming through the south windows. 12 people sat along the walls. Prescott sat at the table with a county land commissioner named Morse, who handled these matters when the circuit judge was in Chamberlain. Red sat across from them with his papers in a neat stack, and his expression carrying the careful neutrality of a man who believes the argument is already finished and is waiting for the room to catch up. Maren sat near the door. She wore the same clothes she had worn all winter, patched and clean. The oilcloth notebook was in her coat pocket. Red spoke first. He was measured and thorough and never raised his voice because he did not need to. The argument was a box with every side closed. Morse listened. He asked Red whether any person or animal had been directly harmed by the structures or the land's drainage modifications. Red said harm was not the applicable standard. Legal standing was. Morse nodded and turned to Maren. "Do you have something to say?" Maren stood. Her English still carried the cadence of Dutch, the vowels sitting slightly further back in the mouth than a native speaker's, the sentences built in an order that was almost but not quite the American order. She spoke slowly and did not try to speak faster than she could speak correctly. "I bought the land," she said. "I paid the tax. I built on it, and I lived on it through the winter. When the blizzard came, 5 people lived because the shelter held." "That is not a legal argument," Red said. "It is a fact." Morse looked at the room. Gideon Brant stood. He spoke in the flat, spare voice of a man giving a sworn account, rather than making a case, measuring his words the way he measured wall plumb for accuracy rather than effect. He named the materials he had spent 30 years working with and said what they did in cold and wind. He named what Maren had used and said what it did in cold and wind. He held up his left hand and showed where 2 fingertips ended now at the first joint, and he said he had spent the storm night behind a haystack on the Hadley property because a building he had helped put up had not kept him, and he had tried to reach the shelter and failed to get there in time. Then he said, "I have built more structures in Douglas County than any man in this room. Frame houses, sod shanties, dugouts, lean-tos. I have never built anything that saved 5 lives in a single night. This girl's shelter did. I lost 2 fingertips because I was caught in a building I trusted. She lost nothing because she was in a building she built herself. If that is not productive use of land, I do not know the meaning of the words." He sat down. Rufus Carr stood. He held out his hands. The frost scars were still there, tight pink skin across the knuckles where the tissue had been damaged and had healed imperfectly. He said what he had said in the general store 2 days after the storm, but shorter this time, without the preamble, just the facts in sequence. The overturned wagon. The children. The direction lost. The mound he had laughed at for 2 months being the only thing he could hold in his mind clearly enough to walk toward in a whiteout. He sat down without elaboration. Then Willa Hewitt stood. She was a small woman who had not spoken publicly since her husband died 3 years earlier. She had been managing quietly the way women managed on the prairie, with constancy rather than noise. She did not make a prepared argument. She did not lay out a legal framework or a list of facts in order. She placed something on the table. A child's wool mitten. Small. Stained. Worn at the thumb from heavy use. Frozen solid when Rufus had carried Ada Hewitt through the tunnel and thawed hours later on the sleeping shelf inside the shelter while the storm ran itself out above. Willa said, "This was frozen to my daughter's hand when the girl pulled her inside." It thawed on the sleeping shelf. "My daughter lived." She paused. "That is the only evidence I have. It is the only evidence I need." The room was silent. Maren reached into her coat pocket and took out the oilcloth notebook. She opened it to the first page and set it on the table beside the mitten. Her mother's handwriting in Dutch, the cross-section of the wall, the labeled layers, the notation in the margin that she had read every night in the pit before the roof was finished. Cold finds the holes before it finds the door. 2 objects on the table, a child's mitten and a dead woman's notebook, against Red's stack of papers that were correct on every legal point he had raised. Morse looked at the table for a long time. He did not rule with grand language. He did not declare the deed valid in perpetuity or cite a principle of law that would be quoted in future cases. He was a county official who held his position because of the people sitting on the benches along the wall, and he understood what was in the room, and he understood what the table held. He tabled the challenge. The petition, he said, would be held without action until Maren Velde reached the age of majority, at which point the deed would be reviewed under standard adult terms. In the meantime, no eviction would proceed, no removal would be ordered, and no party would interfere with the structures or the habitation of the parcel. He looked at Red when he said the last part. "You are within your rights to refile when the holder reaches majority. Until then, this office will not act against a structure that preserved lives during a federally documented weather disaster." Red collected his papers. He stood without any particular change in his expression, because he was a man who had built a career on not showing what he felt in rooms where showing it would cost him something. He walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped. "A tabled motion is not a victory," he said. "It is a delay." Maren looked at him from across the room. "I know about delays," she said. "I built a house 1 block at a time." Red left. He did not file again. Not because the law changed. The law did not change. It was still true that a minor held the parcel on thin legal ground, and that the ground could have been challenged. But the township had seen Willa Hewitt place a child's frozen mitten on a table, and no paper Red could assemble would outweigh the memory of that gesture in a room full of people who had survived the same storm by the same margin and knew it. He moved his desk to Mitchell before the summer was out, where the railroad business was larger, and the competition for distressed claims was conducted at a scale where a single 16-year-old girl with 40 acres of wetland did not factor into his calculations. Prescott filed the relocation notice without comment. In the months that followed, 6 low storm shelters were built within a day's wagon ride of Armour and the Dutch farms south of Plankinton. Not all of them were copies of Maren's original. Some were dug into hillsides where the earth was drier and the slope provided natural drainage. One, built by a Norwegian homesteader named Tolf Hogan, had 2 entry tunnels on opposite sides because Hogan had lost a neighbor in the blizzard, a man who froze 40 yards from his own door because drifted snow had packed the entry solid in the dark, and Hogan intended to sleep easier than that. Most families did not live in the shelters full-time. They kept their frame houses or their soddies for daily life. The turf shelters served as storm refuges, as root cellars in summer where the earth held its temperature against the July heat, as lambing pens in late winter when the young needed warmth the frame house could not reliably provide. They were not replacements. They were a second kind of architecture the prairie had always been capable of offering, and that people were only now learning to ask for. Rufus Carr built one without Maren standing over him. He cursed the entire time. He cut blocks from the wrong part of the rim twice before he went back and reread Vera's numbered instructions, and found the part about the dry band. He discarded more than he kept, which Maren had told him was correct, and he did not believe her until he tried to use a wet block in the third course and watched it collapse under the weight of the one above it. He recut from the dry band. When the shelter was finished and he crawled through the tunnel for the first time and felt the draft die at the dogleg turn, he sat inside for a long time without coming out. When he did come out, he said only, "Fine." The badger was right. Brant began banking the north walls of the outbuildings he constructed with sod running the sod to the window sills on the windward faces. He did not change his trade. He built with boards and nails and right angles because that was what 30 years had made him, and he was too old to unlearn it entirely. But he absorbed the principle. Lower profiles, banked walls, entries oriented away from the prevailing wind. He told Maren once in the fall of that second year, "You didn't invent shelter. You remembered it. Most of us forgot." Vera's instruction sheets traveled further than either of them knew. Folded and passed from hand to hand across the county, copied onto fresh paper by people who had received a copy so worn it was barely legible, carried on wagons going west to claims that had no timber and no way to buy lumber, and a winter coming that cared nothing about either condition. Maren did not track where the pages went. She did not need to. The knowledge was in the ground now, the way roots are in the ground, invisible, binding, and alive whether anyone was watching or not. In the spring of 1892, Maren Velde turned 21. Prescott filed the paperwork on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week as the original hearing, which Maren noticed, and which Prescott did not mention. The deed was reviewed under standard adult terms, as Morse had specified 4 years before. The parcel was still classified as unimprovable wetland. The structures on it were still built from turf and willow and clay and cured reed. The county tax had been paid every year without exception. The deed was confirmed. Red did not contest it. He had been in Mitchell for 4 years by then and had larger concerns and longer ledgers, and the wet 40 had long since ceased to appear anywhere in his accounting. Prescott handed Maren the confirmed deed across his desk and said, "Congratulations, Miss Velde," without any further comment. She folded the deed into the oilcloth notebook in the front where her mother's drawings were alongside the original transfer receipt that Red had written in a hand so precise it looked like the ink was angry at the paper. 2 documents in the same notebook now, the one that had tried to take the land and the one that said the land was hers. The original shelter stood through all of it. She kept the entry clear and the drainage trench maintained, and the turf at the windward face checked each fall for thinning or soft spots where water had found its way in. She used it as a storm room when the sky from the northwest turned the color that people in armor had learned to read since January of 1888. She used it as a root cellar in summer. She used it as a place to sit in the dark on certain evenings and listen to the wind pass over the roof and remember Barnard's breathing in the night and the sound of her mother's handwriting when she read it. The notebook lived in the trunk. It was fat with use by now, the oilcloth cover soft and darkened with handling. It smelled of clay and ink and the faint sharpness of peat that never entirely left the pages her mother had written. Vera's instruction sheets were folded into the back section. Barnard's pencil sketches of improved designs, the wider vent, the double entry flap, the gravel sump at the drainage low point occupied the middle pages. Her mother's cross-sections and layering notations held the front unchanged in the careful, small handwriting of a woman who had pressed a child's palm flat against a wall in Drenthe and said, "Feel the difference." 3 generations of hands in one notebook, 3 ways of knowing the same ground. On a January evening, in that 5th year after the confirmation, the wind came from the northwest. Not the blizzard of 1888, not anything that would make the newspapers or alter the trajectory of lives. Simply winter. The ordinary annual relentless winter of the Dakota prairie. The kind of cold that did not announce itself with a black line on the horizon, but arrived steadily in the night and was present and lethal in the specific way of things that do not need to be dramatic to be serious. The wind struck the low shelter by the slough and found the slope. It ran over the turf the way water runs over a smooth stone in a creek, finding no edge, no seam, no vertical face to shove against. The frozen outer turf gave it nothing to grip. The angled surface offered it no target. The wind arrived and the wind passed, and the air inside the shelter did not move. The silence beneath the passing wind was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a thing that has been built correctly. The silence of a wall that knows what it is doing. The silence of roots that have grown into one another over 5 winters, until the whole roof surface has become a single living skin that the cold cannot enter, and the wind cannot find, and the seasons cannot undo. It was the silence her mother had known in Drenthe, pressing her palms into dark peat and saying cold finds the holes before it finds the door. It was the silence Barnard had known in 40 years of Dakota ditches, reading the water before it moved, making it work, rather than letting it take. It was the silence that Maren Velde had built 1 block at a time from ground that a county survey had called unimprovable, with money that had not been enough in a season that had left no margin for error, while a town watched and laughed and a patient man with a ledger waited for winter to finish her. Winter had not finished her. The wind passed over. The prairie stretched flat and open in every direction, silver and dark under the January stars, and the low mound beside the slough was barely visible from the stock path, just a curve in the earth that looked like the earth deciding to hold its breath. Inside, the clay walls were dry. The smoke-cured reed mat above was stiff and dark and continuous. The earth behind the walls held its stored warmth, the way it had always held it, patient and dense and indifferent to what the air above the ground was doing. The notebook sat in the trunk. The trunk sat on the packed earth floor. The oilcloth was dark with years of handling, and inside the pages were 3 sets of hands. And inside the hands was everything the ground had ever agreed to teach to anyone willing to get down on their knees and ask in the right language. The wind went on across the Douglas County plain. It struck the tall walls first, the frame buildings, the barn peaks, the fence posts standing straight and offering the cold a surface to shove. Then it reached the low black mound by the slough, the one that looked like the earth itself had lain down and refused to get up. The wind ran over the slope. It found no wall. It found no seam. It found no hole. It passed over, and the air inside did not move, and the silence held.